Well, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. I'm just going to, here I am. Okay. Good morning again. Dave was just reciting some of the areas in which I've done work. My role today is more focused on the economy, or as Dr. Warner just put it, on that on why this is a time of forced efficiencies for local governments, for municipalities, counties, and school districts. And so that's what I'm going to do, although we'll stray into some of the other areas, I think. Because any look at the economy, I think, in this context, is a look at what is academically known as the political economy, which includes the economy of public finance and the interaction between finance and the state's economy. So, to begin with, let's create a broader context or a macroeconomic context for understanding what you're looking at in the years ahead. Let me begin with a little history, and I think there's enough people in this room who can appreciate this and relate very personally to it. The era of government in which we're living, the era of government in which you are very actively participating, is actually relatively recent and pretty much spans the lifetimes of people in this room. If you think about it, what might be thought of as the modern era of government in New York really began in earnest in the 1960s, particularly with the passage of the Taylor Law in 1967, which put in place the last major mandate affecting the cost of operating local government on top of Medicaid, which had been established a few years earlier. Well, so we are still less than 50 years. This era is still less than 50 years in duration. And what have we witnessed? Well, there was an era of tremendous stress associated with this sort of, with the implementation and adaptation to public sector collective bargaining and to the growth of the Medicaid program, which became more stressful in the 1970s. The 1970s was that era of what we call stagflation. And that was a type of enormous stress for local government. If you were on a school board then, I was covering them as a reporter then, just out of college. That was the era of the tax revolt in New York and other states. Why? Because inflation was pushing up the costs of goods and services, and in particular the costs of the labor contracts that were being sought by the newly emergent teacher unions and other local unions, and it was putting stress on taxes at the local level, and people were reacting to increases in their taxes. So we had a full-blown tax revolt that in some states led to some lasting and fairly severe reforms, such as Proposition 13 in California, Proposition 2.5 in Massachusetts. But since the 80s, starting in the early 80s and after the recession of 1982-83, what we experienced from the early 80s until the end of 2007 was a series of, was a boom and bust era. The booms were strong and prolonged and extraordinary and historic in terms of what they spun off in revenues and economic growth, even in a state that was in relative decline compared to the rest of the country, which is New York. So everybody who came of age in government in New York State has as their frame of reference an era, the boom and bust era. The busts were relatively shallow and the booms were extraordinarily strong. And I'll get near the end of my presentation to what the effect on tax revenues were. But what's different about the time in which we're now living and having to plan? Well, to use what's now become an almost hackneyed frame, this is a new normal for the economy. The recovery from the Great Recession, which is officially dated from the end of 2007 into 2009, has been one of the most sluggish and weakest economic recoveries on record, both in terms of job growth and income growth. Economic instability, as measured by data favored by macroeconomists, has actually increased significantly. Volatility in financial markets has increased. And all of these things spell trouble for the governance structure that we've built up across the country in different forms and here in New York. That's the frame for looking at the economy today. What is the new normal characterized by? Well, among other things, at the moment, it's characterized by very low consumer price inflation. In fact, there was a deflationary tendency during the recession, which in the private sector, for many people, was manifested by an actual reduction temporarily in pay. unlike the 70s, the one good thing about inflation, if you can use the word good in connection with it, especially in the late 70s for local government, was that revenues grew very quickly. Inflation shrinks liabilities. A crucial reason that New York City emerged from the fiscal crisis, from its brush with bankruptcy in the 1970s, was inflation. Inflation shrunk the city's liabilities, and it did so to a lesser extent, but across the map of local governance. We don't have that now. We have a different set of problems. And we're in a slow growth era for the foreseeable future. And I'm going to now show you what that slow growth is characterized by. First of all, however, while the recession had its epicenter in New York State, specifically on Wall Street, where we all became conscious of the economic calamity that had happened when Lehman Brothers went bankrupt in September 2008. The literal epicenter of the financial crisis at the heart of the recession was New York. And yet New York basically had a fairly gentle recession. New York lost fewer jobs in the recession and recovered more quickly. Why? Two reasons. New York had soared less in the boom, which I'm going to show you in a moment, and New York then benefited from the federal government's response to the recession, which was to bail out and pump money into the financial markets and into Wall Street. And that's why the state actually had a fairly gentle recession. Nonetheless, the fiscal stresses are real and continuing. Let's look at employment, which remains the best available indicator of where we stand. The red line is the United States, is the nation as a whole. The dark line, the dark blue line or black line on this chart is New York State. Note, New York State's private sector employment grew more slowly than the nation as a whole. If you look at those numbers in percentage terms, we grew about half as fast as the rest of the country from 2000 to 2007. Then we did not plunge at as steep a rate. We did not lose as many jobs. And because we had never gained as many jobs in the first place, we were back to our previous employment peak years ahead of the rest of the country. The U.S. just recently got back to where it had been before the recession. We've been back there for a few years. But note, this is a 14-year chart. If you look at the subtle end of the chart, note that really the steepness of our curve is descending, if you will. New York is slowing down gradually, and I'll illustrate that in more detail in the next slide. The nation's recovery, while still very sluggish by historical terms, is getting stronger. Here's specifically the last 3 years. It coincides with Governor Cuomo's tenure, but I picked the last 3 years because it's just past the trough of employment on both the state and federal level also. Note, basically, if you go back to the end of 2010, beginning of 2011, for the first year and a half of Governor Cuomo's tenure into 2012 and into the fall of 2012, we were basically adding jobs on a seasonally adjusted basis at the exact same rate as the rest of the U.S. Then notice the jog down. That's the hurricane, that's Sandy. Sandy causes an immediate jolt to the downstate economy, but while there's a recovery downstate, since then, it's coincidental that Sandy was the start of it, we have fallen further and further behind the rest of the country in our job creation rate. And we're now consistently producing jobs at a slower rate than the rest of the U.S., as a state as a whole. And in fact, the governor's budget division projects this will continue. These are the job growth rates for total payroll jobs, projected in the latest state budget. Note, the red bar is New York State, the blue bar is the national average. The governor's own budget projects that we are going to grow much more slowly than the rest of the country in terms of annual job growth for the foreseeable future, as far out as the budget predicts. What that translates into, in terms of the context of today's gathering, is again, more pressure to realize and search for savings, even if they're marginal savings and marginal costs at the local level, because this is the entire state economy. In fact, it's difficult to generalize about the entire state economy because within these state numbers is a striking extraordinary regional disparity. The blue bar, the blue line, is downstate New York, which I define as the MTA region, New York City, Long Island, Lower Hudson Valley. The black line is upstate New York. Note, upstate New York actually is still below its employment level of 14 years ago. It's below its 2000 level of employment. Upstate New York is essentially, with a few exceptions here and there, flat on its back. There is no growth in upstate New York, as measured by employment numbers, as also measured in real terms even by indicators such as sales tax receipts, property values, et cetera. There's really no real growth to speak of in upstate New York. More recently, in fact, that's also been true. That trend and that phenomenon has been moving down the Hudson Valley, and more recently in the last year or two, that's also been true of right down into Westchester. Very little growth. Outside of a few pockets, where Mildred comes from, the People's Republic of Ithaca has had strong growth. All of it in a local economic developer in Ithaca calls it that, so I'm just imitating him. Basically, it's all in the education field. It's generally Cornell and Ithaca College related, and that is a very small regional economy. It's tiny. It's sort of a boutique. Outside of Ithaca, and in most years Glens Falls, all of upstate New York is weak. Even Albany, while having some good years recently, considering the billions, and I mean literally billions of dollars in state resources that have been pumped into nanotech and chip fab operations in Albany, Albany is still not as strong as you would think. It's not particularly impressive in terms of its economic growth. And that partly has to do also with retrenchment in state government. The rest of the state is really weak, and where is the absolute weakest part of the upstate economy? People from that region here may want to guess. What is the absolute weakest region of upstate New York? Well, let me give you a hint. It overlays very neatly with the map of the Marcellus Shale Formation. And that is the southern tier and the lower western tier are not only flat, they're declining. They're losing jobs. Binghamton, Elmira, losing jobs. Very, very weak. In fact, it's difficult to find many regions in the entire United States, many metro areas, that rate on the scale of metro areas and are so measured that way, that have had weaker growth for longer years than the communities in the southern tier and the western tier going out to Jamestown. It's truly remarkable and I think is obviously a concern. So that's the disparity. It's really been a tale of two states. Let me illustrate again. Here's a map. The monthly Labor Department press release from the State Labor Department puts out this handy map. It's handy because at a glance, all you have to know looking at this is the 1 year private sector job growth rate. All you have to know is dark is bad. Dark is shrinkage or no growth. If the county has a dark shading, nothing's happening. If a county has light shading, it's got some growth. Now note, there's a pocket. Steuben County has had a few good things happening. I haven't even inquired as to what that is. I suspect that some of it is Corning related, probably. So it's possible in a county the size of Steuben to have a good month and have it shape the effect for the whole year when you're doing a year-to-year growth rate.